I mean to give the French a damn good thrashing.
Time and again during the Peninsular War, the British infantry were able to take on and beat the might of the French army. But how were the redcoats organised, and what were the tactics that made them so successful? The British army of the Napoleonic era was very small compared to the French army, the Austrian and the Russian forces. In 1809, for example, the army's entire infantry contingent comprised just 3 regiments of foot guards, 103 regiments of the line, 8 West India regiments, 8 so-called veteran battalions, 10 battalions of the King's German Legion, and 10 more of various foreign units. Some regiments, including the Guards and the 60th Royal Americans, did have multiple battalions, but many had only one. The total number of infantrymen at Britain's disposal was less than 200,000, and many of these soldiers were needed for service across Britain's growing empire, meaning not all of them were available to fight the French. A line infantry battalion, which is the unit I'm focusing on in today's video, comprised 10 companies. 8 of these were known as centre companies, and 2 as flank companies. They were the Grenadier and Light Company. The Grenadier Company comprised the biggest and most impressive looking men. They would take the position of honour on the right of the battalion, while the Light Company, which generally included the fittest and most intelligent soldiers, took the left position on the battalion. Companies were often further subdivided into platoons of 50 men and sections of 25. In theory, at full strength, a battalion would number 1,000 men with 35 officers. But the reality was that during the Peninsula, it was very rare for a battalion to muster anywhere near this number. In fact, it was common for a battalion to only field around 500 men. A lieutenant colonel commanded the battalion. On paper there would also be 2 majors, 10 captains, 1 for each company, and approximately 20 subalterns, which was ensigns and lieutenants. An ensign was like a second lieutenant today. As with all armies, non-commissioned officers were the backbone of the regiment. There was 1 sergeant major in each battalion. This man assisted the adjutant and would be a master of drill and every aspect of military discipline.
Even though I'm a sergeant.
Below the sergeant major were several staff sergeants with specialised roles, such as paying the men or looking after the battalion's weapons. Each company would normally have 2 sergeants and 3 corporals. These men handled the day-to-day running of the companies and much of the administration. A good NCO would be an experienced soldier who could read and write and knew how best to manage and motivate the men under him. Then, as now, it was an incredibly important position. The British Army in the Peninsula was a well-oiled fighting machine, highly disciplined, well-drilled and trained to fire their muskets quickly. The thin line of redcoats defeated the massed columns of the French time and again. But how did they do it?
They're coming on in the same old style.
So we'll have to meet them in the same old style.
Let me try and briefly explain the 2 infantry formations that were most used in the Peninsula. First, there was the column formation. The column was the fastest way to manoeuvre troops across a battlefield without them losing cohesion. These blocks of men, usually made up of battalions, could keep a tight formation and be thrown quickly into mass attacks. The weakness was that while the men were in column, very few of them could actually fire their musket. Therefore, according to the military doctrine of the time, these columns were meant to rapidly deploy into line formation just before engaging with the enemy. This would allow the advancing unit to bring the maximum number of muskets to bear before launching their final charge. But changing formation in the face of the enemy was a complicated business, and the French, overconfident after years of victory, often used their columns simply as battering rams to smash through the enemy using elan and weight of numbers. This tactic had been successful for them across Europe, but against the disciplined redcoats of the Peninsular War, it failed repeatedly. The redcoats favoured meeting the French while formed in a 2-deep line. They would stand silently, the front rank kneeling while the rear rank stood behind them. Technically, according to Dundas's official drill manual, the British, like other European armies, were meant to form a 3-deep line. But lack of men forced the British to improvise, and soon the 2-deep line had become the norm. A classic British tactic was to form this line on the reverse slope of a hill, 50 metres down from the crest. This protected the men from the French artillery and their skirmishers. As the French column crested the hill, the redcoats would open fire, volleys rippling along the line. We must remember that the smooth-bore muskets of the time were very inaccurate. I've got a whole episode about it with Rob from British Muzzleloaders. Hence, the officers preferred the men to hold their fire until as late as possible. Simple mathematics meant that a battalion formed in line could bring more firepower to bear than one formed in a dense column, in which most of the men were hemmed in and impotent. After firing one or two devastating volleys, the British infantry were charged with fixed bayonets and forced the French to retreat in disorder. Another important infantry formation of the time is the received cavalry square. As we saw on my episode on the Battle of Albuera, an infantry unit caught in the open by enemy cavalry could quickly be outflanked, charged from all sides and rolled up. The result could be terrible. To avoid this, an infantry battalion could form a hollow square with 4 ranks of men on all 4 sides. 2 ranks would kneel and 2 would stand. This formed an almost impenetrable wall of bayonets that the attacking horses, intelligently, would not charge. As you may recall from episode 27 of the podcast about the Battle of Fuentes de Oñoro, the Light Division successfully formed multiple squares at that battle and was still able to manoeuvre effectively across the battlefield, even while being pursued by enemy cavalry and artillery. Despite the success against cavalry, though, the square could become a death trap for the defenders if the enemy could deploy sufficient infantry and artillery to support the horsemen, and then they would just be trapped and just be getting smashed from all sides. Well, there you have it, guys. A very quick and dirty breakdown of British infantry regiments and their tactics during the Peninsular War. If you like this sort of content, then please comment, like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel to grow.